Hello and welcome back to Virtual Classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the 18th century Atlantic economy. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about what life was like in Europe, culturally speaking, during the 18th century. And we're going to keep on kind of discussing this 18th century, what is really going on. Remember, the culmination of all these things, whether it's the absolutism, whether it's the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, now all these things culturally, economically, so we talk about the politics, the economy, and of course, culture. And all these things are going to culminate by the end of period 2 of AP Euro, which of course is the French Revolution and Napoleon. And all these events are going to culminate right there. As you can see, we're going to start talking about some of the colonial wars today. But let's start with the economy itself, and specifically mercantilism. Now, we've already talked about a little bit how mercantilism is kind of on the way out. But for much of the 17th century, especially when you consider the Atlantic economy, again, within Europe, we're moving toward capitalism. But in the empire imperial system of the Atlantic economy, the colonies and the Americas, well, we're still very much in line with mercantilism. And so world trade became fundamental to the European economy. And of course, the most important commodity. Now, I understand from a United States perspective, we're going to think, well, it's cotton. Well, that's actually much later. Well, it's tobacco, because you all know Jamestown. But on a global scale, the number one commodity being grown and harvested through the use of enslaved Africans was, of course, sugar. And sugar becomes the most important commodity produced in the Atlantic. Yes, we're going to have cotton, especially a little bit later. We're going to have indigo. We're going to have rice. We're going to have tobacco. Those are all big, important commodities. Of course, silver, gold. But sugar becomes the number one dominant commodity. And the reality is, it is predicated upon, well, two things. One, colonization, and number two, the use of enslaved Africans. And thus, the slave trade is paramount to any discussion regarding the Atlantic economy. In fact, during the 17th century, both Spain and Portugal, who had been kind of falling hard times, the Portuguese lost the slave trade, they lost the Indian Ocean trade to the Dutch. The Spanish had been going through some hard times, the War of Spanish Succession, and in a resulting split with the Holy Roman Empire. And during the 17th century, they begin to revitalize their empires. They start making a comeback. And they grow economically from renewed development in their colonies and doubling down on the use of enslaved Africans. The ones who really begin to benefit the most, though, are the Dutch, the British, and, of course, the French. Now, by far, the largest number of immigrants to the New World was, in fact, the British. Now, remember, other nations had colonies as well. But as far as number of people leaving the homeland to go to the New World, it is by far and away the British. It's one of the reasons why the United States is so different than, say, Mexico. Remember, Mexico was colonized by a few Spaniards who intermingled and created mestizos and later Mexicans. And throughout much of the Americas, that's what the policy is. You have a few elites come over and run the colony and use local sources of labor. The United States, what became the United States, is very different because it was heavily emigrated by the British. Now, of course, the main goal of mercantilism is, of course, self-sufficiency. And they did so by using colonies to produce raw materials and enacting large tariffs on imports to ensure that you buy their products. They also employ what's called bullionism, which is building up large reserves of gold and silver. And by doing so, you are able to, of course, have that monetary stability. Now, of course, the largest of all of these became the largest maritime industry was Great Britain. And one of the most important sources of wealth was the Bank of England. In 1694, they are founded to provide an important source of capital for economic development. The Act of Union we talked about previously in 1707 unified both Scotland and England. And again, Scotland initially wanted this as a way to gain access to the British trade. And what we see here is a slow but sure shoring up of British stability. And of course, one of the big ways they do so is back in the 1650s through the Navigation Acts. Remember, they were passed by Parliament to increase both the private wealth and military power of Great Britain. Now, from a U.S. perspective, we always said that, well, it's to bankrupt the Dutch and to control the Atlantic Ocean trade. And it was. But there were ulterior motives from a European perspective. And so they passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, 1660, and 1663. And yes, they do require that most goods imported from Europe be go route through Great Britain first. They must be on British-owned ship with British captains and crews. And of course, this was done to shore up private interest and shore up British power and authority. And of course, the not-so-triangular trade will revolve around this trade system that flowed these goods, again, through the Navigation Acts, yes, but flowed these goods between the colonies, the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and Europe. And again, much of this trade, however, there was another route where New England colonists would ship rum to Africa to trade for enslaved Africans. And they would be headed for ships to the West Indies to trade for molasses that was then shipped back to the colonies. So notice that this version of the triangle, you see that in the black line on your screen. The rum trade for slaves to get molasses taken back to New England. This was actually an illegal trade. And so, yes, this is technically a triangle, yes, but it is illegal under the Navigation Acts. But still, both English and Americans made fortunes by doing this. And again, the idea being, this is a way, again, cementing that American identity that's going to play out later in life. And of course, all of this hinged on the slave trade. The dramatic growth of the Atlantic trade was due in large part to the use of slave labor. Somewhere around 10 to 12 million Africans were kidnapped and transported during the 17th and 18th century. Half of the slave trade occurred on British ships, and about 25% on French ships, and the rest divided among the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Danish, and the Americans. Remember, most slaves are captured on the interior of Africa and marched to the coast. Somewhere around 25% will die on this first leg of the trade. Another 25% will die on what is referred to as the Middle Passage, the period in which they're on the ocean, in putrid, horrid conditions. Now, I am not going to go into much detail about this because we've already gone through this and belabor this point in, say, U.S. history, or you've learned about it in world history. But what it did create, this entire trade system, the Atlantic system, was it created what's called bubbles. And there were two main bubbles. The first one was the South Sea bubble, and the other one was the Mississippi bubble. Now, these bubbles are very important because the reality is, despite all their economic success, both Britain and France had massive national debts due to numerous wars during the 17th and 18th century. French-Indian War, 7 Years' War. And they created these so-called bubbles to recoup their losses. So, we often get the idea in U.S. history that, okay, so we had the French-Indian War, 7 Years' War, and so we taxed the colonists, and that's what caused the revolution. Well, that's true. It was not that the British only tried to tax the colonists. They had tried other ways to recoup their losses without taxing the colonists. And one example of this is the South Sea bubble in 1720. Now, in 1719, the British government gave what they call the South Sea Company the rights to take over the national debt. Isn't that nice of them? Hey, we're going to make you a private company. You know what? Your first job is to take on the national debt. Now, what they did in order to encourage this and make this company want to do this was to give a monopoly over the slave trade with Latin America. And so they gave the South Sea Company a monopoly on the slave trade. So the British Crown gives its monopoly to the South Sea Company, and they control the slave trade. The company would then presumably make lots and lots of money to pay off the national debt, and any interest on that debt would collect to pay off the government debt. Now, this sounds good in theory. So you want to recoup your losses fast, you give this private company the national debt, you give them access to the slave trade, a monopoly on it, let them make lots of money and pay off the debt for you. Again, it's creative. I'll give them that. The problem is when investors didn't make their money back fast enough, the company began to convert the debt owed to them into stock, which a speculative phase of frenzied buying and selling of stocks artificially raised the price of the stock prices as investors believed that prices would continue to go upwards. And in 1720, the bubble burst, creating the kind of first large-scale financial crash. In other words, this is exactly what happened in 1929 with the U.S. Great Depression. You have artificially buying of stocks that artificially increases the prices. People think it's going to keep going up, 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 up. And when it doesn't, it bursts. Prices come tumbling down. Everyone loses. And as a result of this, it took years to restore the confidence in the British government's ability to repay debts. They tried a second attempt. The French tried another attempt at this in French Louisiana. So in 1720 as well, the Mississippi Company was given a monopoly by the French government on trade with the French Louisiana and North America. And likewise, in 1719, the company took over the French national debt. And in 1720, after the dramatic price increases in stock shares, the price of stocks collapsed and the Mississippi Company was ruined. The national debt in France staggered and will play, of course, a major role in the French Revolution just 70 years later. So notice, both France and England tried to deal with the debt problem by being creative and offering these monopolies to private companies who, through selling of stocks, artificially inflate the price. When this comes crashing down, they go belly up, and confidence in the mother countries is ruined. So both mother countries end up taxing the colonists instead, which is going to lead, of course, to what we call colonial wars. Number one being the American Revolution, later on the French Revolution. So we can talk about a few different colonial wars. Of course, the first one I'm not going to belabor because we've already talked about it, the War of Spanish Succession. Now, before we get there, though, notice these wars start taking place from about 1689 to 1815. That could almost be termed a second 100 Years' War. Now, both Britain and France become the two main adversaries in the colonial wars of independence. Then after 1815, you start having the Latin American ones against the Spanish. So between 1701 and 1783, both Britain and France will engage in a series of wars over the issue of territorial colonial expansion and maritime trade. Now remember, France has the largest army on land and was trying to build its naval forces. The Netherlands and Spain were kind of in decline, and the Portuguese were already in abject decline. So in effect, these are world wars because they do fight both fighting in Europe as well as in the colonies and in the seas. And the first one we want to talk about really quick is the War of Spanish Succession. And again, this war we're going to skip over pretty quickly because we've already talked about it. But it does start costing France land. In fact, France loses Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay Territory to the British in Canada. So they already lose much of Canada to the British, and of course, they'll lose the rest of it in the 7 Years' War. Spain loses the slave trade to Britain. So Britain takes over the slave trade. And one of the big things of the outcomes of this war, though, was that the Spanish also agreed to allow one British ship of merchandise per year to go through Panama, because the Spanish controlled Panama, and if you remember the map, it's a long way to go around the tip of Chile, around South America. And so you want to go through what is now the Panama Canal, but back then, no canal. And because the Spanish controlled Panama, part of the treaty that ended the War of Spanish Succession was the Spanish had to allow one British ship per year. Well, in 1739, Spain alleges that the British were abusing that Treaty of Utrecht that allowed Britain to send one ship per year through Panama. The Spanish officials boarded a British ship suspected of smuggling goods into Latin America. So, here's the situation. There was this Treaty of Utrecht, the end of the War of Spanish Succession, that allowed one British ship per year to go through Panama. The Spanish argued that British were abusing this policy and smuggling goods in illegally. So in 1739, the Spanish board one of the British ships, and in their anger, they cut off the ear of Captain Jenkins, a British officer. Now, rather than get mad and start a war over this, Captain Jenkins kept his ear in a jar of brandy. And 7 years later, when he returned home, he presented this ear, being preserved in brandy, to Parliament. In response to this atrocity of cutting off his ear, King George II went to war with Spain. Now, this is a small interlude into what is known as the War of Austrian Succession. And again, we've already talked about with the issue of the new empress, Maria Theresa, who refuses to be, or we're not allowed to be Home Enrolled Emperor. She tries to annex Silesia of the Prussian Empire and ultimately develops into the War of Austrian Succession. And of course, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle will preserve status quo, but it begins to devolve into, of course, the 7 Years' War. Now, of course, in 1754, it begins in the colonies as the French Indian War and will officially become global in 1756 and end in 1763. This becomes the largest war of the 18th century. And again, I'm not going to go through all the issues, but you all remember the story. It starts with Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity with General George Washington. And the French forces are doing quite well against the American colonies and the British until William Pitt becomes the new prime minister in 1756, and his new strategy is throw money at the problem. And he does. He begins to throw money not only to the Prussian Empire, but he throws money at the colonies. He throws money at the naval, and the Navy, the British Navy is going to not only take on the French on the high seas and kick their butts. Remember, France invested in an army, not a navy. And as a result of this, British becomes the dominant empire of Europe. And of course, Spain will try to enter the war on the French side, also get their butts kicked, which will see Britain seizing Cuba and the Philippines from Spain for a time. Now, ultimately, it'll end with the Treaty of Paris. And the big deal is French is basically forced to lose all their North American colonies. They also lose full control of India to the British. And ultimately, the French are decimated. They are at 1/16 of their pre-war levels. Humiliating defeat for the French. But then comes the big one. Because in the American Revolution, the American colonies are in open rebellion. And once the French enter the war, again, the French want to restore that balance of power. They feel like that the British have upset that balance of power that had kind of solidified Europe for so many hundreds of years. And France gives significant financial and military support to the United States. The 13 colonies have been Britain's most valuable asset for both trade and raw materials. And while this did work, it did knock British down a peg. It took away their most valuable possession. It did restore a balance of power in Europe, allow the French to regain some dignity and control. Of course, what's going to happen is it's going to serve as inspiration for more and more wars of the 19th century, including, of course, the French Revolution. But while all this is happening in North America, we have some problems in Latin America. Because while the American colonies were the British main source of wealth until they lost them, in the 18th century, Spain's colonies were still an important part of the Atlantic economy. The silver mining had finally recovered in both Mexico and Peru. And between the Mexico and Peru, they accounted for half of the world's supply of silver. And as a result of this, under Philip V, the Spanish Empire would experience a recovery and rebuild its navy to the third most powerful in the world behind Britain and later France. But those Creoles, the Spaniards born in Latin America, came to rival the power of Spanish authorities. And they, on the one hand, did what the mother country wanted. They did seek to recreate a European-style aristocracy in Latin America that would subject the mestizos and the native Indians to untold atrocities, forcing them to work in the silver mines. But as the mestizos began to grow in population, they began to think, well, wait, hold on, we're half Spanish blood. Why are we being subjected to this as well? And they start rising to the level of merchant class or a middle class station. Then those Creoles, those American-born Spaniards, began to think, well, why are we lesser? And this, of course, is going to set the stage for independence in Latin America. And don't forget, while Amerindians are the number one source of labor in the countryside, in the mines, black slavery will also remain, especially in places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the largest place, of course, being Brazil. The sugar plantations of Brazil require massive numbers of slaves. And by the 19th century, half of Brazil's population was of African descent. The Portuguese, Indian, and African populations in Brazil intermixed socially to create a greater degree in the Spanish Empire, resulting in a very multicolored, multiracial, multi-ethnic population. But in all these areas, all this diversity in Latin America is going to cause change in the 19th century that we collectively term the Latin American Wars of Independence. So as we can see, there's a lot of turmoil. So while things were kind of doing okay-ish with the Enlightenment on Europe proper, on a global scale, there's a lot of turmoil and things in flux. Lots of warfare, lots of chaos, lots of questioning whether or not the status quo is really working. And of course, that going back to the idea of the balance of power. Change is coming. Yes, the American colonies are now lost to Britain, but more change is coming. We'll talk about that next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.